Hello, good afternoon. I think it's just gone midday. Before we begin today, CEDA acknowledges that today and every day we are on the Aboriginal land, committed to recognition and reconciliation. We respect elders and we support their stated aspirations. I would like to acknowledge and pay my respect to the traditional custodians of the land on which I am today. For me, that is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. So hello everyone, my name is Diane Rutter. I'm a partner at PwC and I lead our customer experience practice within government and public sector. I'm really passionate about working with government to build trust with citizens and improve social outcomes by putting citizens at the centre of policy design and service delivery. And I'm absolutely honoured and thrilled to be your host and moderator today of an amazing panel of speakers who I'll introduce to you all shortly. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to you all of you online virtually with us today. So I want to welcome you to CEDA's event today on the topic of digitisation of services, where we will be discussing the practical and pragmatic steps that governments can take to digitise services, to support individuals to access services when and how they need to, and to modernise service delivery to future-proof for the longer term. And this is important now more than ever as we see the relationship between government and citizens change. Trust with government is higher more than ever. Access to critical services matters now more than ever. We have seen the demand for services continue to increase and community expectations change, driven by the pandemic. So responsiveness from government to ever-changing situations and society's needs is critical. And the opportunity now exists to further increase the role of digital technology in service delivery. And we've seen some incredible responses from the New South Wales government over the last few months in response to the pandemic. So while embarking on this journey, we need to also be cognizant of equitable access to services and balancing digital servicing with the right human support for vulnerable individuals. This is amplified now more than ever with the lack of those in-person interactions coming from social isolation, and we know having impacts on mental health. However, what I'm really excited about is that the advances in analytics and technology, we have such an incredible opportunity to really boldly harness and embed human experiences and capabilities, things such as empathy, innovation, creativity, into a reimagined service ecosystem. So how do we tackle all of this? Well, this is what we'll be exploring with our amazing speakers today. So just a quick overview of how today will work before we move into introductions of the speakers. So like many, through the height of the pandemic, CEDA's discussion forums have moved to an online platform as of today. And as we slowly return to business as usual, CEDA will return to face-to-face events, of course supported with the live stream discussions as well. To keep abreast of the range of events and discussions on the most important issues impacting Australians' economic and social development, we encourage you to visit CEDA's website, ceda.com.au, where you can also register for upcoming events, watch the recordings of past live streams, including this one at the end, regular podcasts, video interviews and blogs with some of our leading experts and policymakers. So as per the normal form for CEDA events, you'll be able to interact with the speakers through our Q&A portal, which is available via the link below the video on your screen, or you can log into Pigeonhole using the passcode Digitization and submit some questions. It also has the functionality so you can like preferred questions, so those get prioritized to the top. Please put forward your questions at any time and we'll endeavour to get through as many as possible in the hour that we have together. And finally, you can also join the conversation on Twitter by using today's hashtag, which is hashtag Digitization. And of course, remember to tag CEDA in your posts. And I'd also like to thank and acknowledge Griffith University Business School for their sponsorship of today's event on behalf of CEDA. So I'd like to now introduce our incredible speakers to lead this important discussion. Our speakers today are the Honourable Victor Dominello MP and Minister for Customer Service, the Right Honourable Sir Bill English, Chair of the Impact Lab and former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Dr. Rob Grenfell, Director Health and Biosecurity from CSIRO, and Sarah Kaur, Chief Strategy Officer from Portable. Thank you all so much for your time and for sharing your views over the next hour with us. So to get us started, we'll start by hearing from each speaker for about 5 minutes to get their perspectives on this important topic. I'll kick off with a question to get things rolling, and we'll move through each of the speakers before we open up for some of the audience questions. So, Minister, if okay, I might start with you to get your broad perspectives for the next few minutes, and maybe starting with the question of how could we further invest in and leverage digital more broadly as part of the stimulus to accelerate COVID-19 recovery and longer-term reform?
Well, thanks, Diane. Well, you must invest in digital. If anything's come out of this pandemic, it's the realization that we must accelerate digital transformation. And rhetoric will only take you so far. You actually have to put money into it. And here in New South Wales, we put in $1.6 billion in terms of a digital restart fund to further accelerate the digital transformation in our state. And that's 1.6 over 3 years. It's a record spend because we realise the importance of it. If there were two words that really encapsulate the various governments' response to this pandemic, it's pace and agility. And if I could just walk you quickly through some of the things that we have done here in New South Wales, where digital is really the only medium that enables us to deliver both speed and agility. So the very first one was in relation to getting the mobility data early on in the piece so we could see where people were moving. Again, it was all aggregated, all not anonymous, but that mobility data was a proxy for the spread of the virus, and getting that very quickly helped us frame a whole lot of policy decisions. Another thing we did very quickly, again using digital mediums, was grants. When small businesses in particular were on their knees, we had to deliver a digital grants product. We were getting money online into businesses' accounts within 72 hours, which was much needed support for businesses, much better than paper and checks. And I'll see you in the post in a couple of months. Another thing that we did very early on in the piece was opened up data, which was critical to communication. So we were the first state in the country to open up data on terms of cases, in terms of hotspots, in terms of tests. Again, that's important when it goes to communication. It's important when it goes to trust in terms of government and services and ongoing communication. Another one we did, which was again the first in the country, was to do the text messaging services. Again, using digital formats, where traditionally we know that 98% of people that get a COVID test is going to be negative. But you do not want them waiting at home for 2 weeks, waiting for that elusive phone call. If we could turn around the messaging within 24 hours, which we did via a text message, it means people that are negative are not stressed and they can go back into the workplace, which is productive. And those that are positive, the 2% or less, they get the personalised phone call so that the contact tracing can begin. And that leads me to another thing that we're doing. We're doing in check-in services. So again, through Service New South Wales, you can download the app. You can go to small businesses that are higher risk, such as restaurants, pubs, clubs, cafes, particularly those indoor that involve service of alcohol. They're your higher risk propositions, but even gyms. You get your QR code, download that. When people are moving in, you can then check in through your service app. That data goes directly to New South Wales Health, so that in the event that there is an outbreak there, you get notified to come in for a test or to get your test to assist in the contact tracing. And then I'll finish with one last example, and that's border passes. We saw recently that there was an outbreak in Victoria, and we obviously had to deal with that very quickly. So we had to set up a digital border permit system. So again, going online, downloading your border pass, and that enabled people to transit with visibility between Victoria and New South Wales, and in particular for the border communities that are going through a lot of grief because of this. But all of these, and we turned that around in 72 hours. This was not a year in development, 72 hours from the time the Premier said we need to get a digital border pass. 72 hours later, it was online, ready for distribution. So all of these things that I've described required immense speed, much faster than government normally operates, let me tell you, and enormous agility. Like, we are moving like this all the time, and that's likely to continue. We're likely to get more and more examples of this until we get the vaccine, and please God that happens sooner rather than later. But you can't do any of this without digital, and you need investment into digital. So I might just leave it there.
Thank you so much, Minister, for sharing some of those examples. Certainly incredible amount of work delivered at pace, as you suggest, and makes me very proud to be a citizen within New South Wales, I must say. And being a small business owner myself, the support provided by the government and the ease of accessing that support has been phenomenal. So thank you.
Thanks, Diane, for the feedback.
I might move over to Bill, and I'm quite keen to understand, what role do you see digital servicing playing in making Australia an innovation leader of the future?
Well, first, can I acknowledge all the efforts of the New South Wales government? It was great to hear from the Minister about that agility and speed, because if you want to be being innovative in the future, is got a high relevance in government. I mean, right now we're dealing with still really the initial shock of COVID, but you're looking out over a period of many years where there'll be very large debt levels, fiscal constraint, and greater social need. And the techniques that the Minister's just described need to be applied to core government activities with the same speed and agility. I was thinking of, when he quoted the example of the border pass, people I've been working with recently who family with children with complex needs, and in New Zealand they're going through 3 quite separate bureaucratic processes to access what are actually critical services for them, and what they need is the equivalent of a border pass. That is the digitisation of those processes and their part in them, so that the kind of exhausting, demoralising process they have to go through can be taken away. And I think there's enormous opportunity there, and I hope Australia does become an innovator, because then New Zealand can copy it. The people with the least resource face the greatest complexity in accessing services they need, because your services, as government services, aren't designed for high complexity. 15% of the population in New South Wales probably use around 50% of the public services, right? So the highest ranked 15% use half of all public services, but the public services are largely designed for the other 85%. That is commodity services, accessible to people who have a reasonable capacity to do it, and it works pretty well. But for the bottom 15%, it's a nightmare, frankly. It's unpredictable and difficult and repetitive, and not always respectful of their complex needs. And I think that's the area where there is the greatest possibilities for innovation. So we've done, particularly in state governments in Australia, particularly New South Wales, have done a great job with the Services New South Wales idea. And that's a lot of the business transactions with government. And now it's time, I think, to apply a lot of that framework to your core social services. Just a couple of further points from experience in going down this track over the last sort of 10 years, really. The technology, the plug-in technology, is now so cheap and so accessible. There really isn't any excuse for public agencies to not be using it. Of course, they've got legacy systems, but you can build around those, you can build over them, you can connect into them and suck the data out. But the investment required now is much lower and much more agile, and it's OPEX driven rather than CapEx driven. And in my experience anyway, government agencies are kind of 5 to 7 years behind that understanding of the technology, whereas the business world, they tend to be a bit more tuned into it. I think the last point I'd make is to get the kind of scale of digitisation we want does require political leadership. Remember, your state agencies don't need to do this. They've got no existential threats. If anything, they feel bulked up and more monopolistic now than they used to, because of the high focus on government of the COVID process and decision process. So they do what they want to do, and that requires some real political leadership. And I think setting, pretty basic, crude targets works as a way of motivating them, because they won't. They'll move at half speed. Nothing like the agility and the speed that the minister talked about. The final point I'd make is not to make too many assumptions about the digital divide. We do need to be careful about forcing people into digital channels when they don't want to be there. And a customer-centric service won't do that. It will encourage them, but not force them. On the other hand, I was always consistently surprised at the uptake of digitised services among apparently disadvantaged groups, including even the chronically disabled. Whereas I'm involved with a business where we have about 90% uptake with a portal that runs something like the NDIS does. So I think we've got to be just customer sensitive rather than making assumptions about who can handle digitisation. Because remember, if you're addressing a pain point, it's amazing who's willing to become digitally literate to address that pain point. I just by a very, very simple example, involved with a process where reducing 42 forms and 16 hours down to 30 minutes. Now, I can tell you the people facing the 42 forms, they're willing to do almost anything, including learn how to operate an iPhone to avoid that pain point.
Thank you, Bill, for sharing your perspectives, and your depth of experience is invaluable. I've had a sneak peek at some of the questions coming through, and your comments around complex needs and ensure we're factoring those in. Certainly something we'll be exploring through the audience questions. I might turn to you, Rob. And I'm quite interested in, there are clearly a number of different domains that need to come together to digitise services and human services. Can you tell us a bit more about your views on the most critical domains to focus on immediately and why we would do this?
Yeah, look, if there ever was an opportunity for digital health, and I guess if there's anything positive to come out of this pandemic, it's the enthusiasm that we've seen in the health sector for the rapid switching over to digital, or at least telemedicine services. But it's really the thing that's disheartening is that it's phone calls. And there's much more to digital care, and in fact, actually human health care than just a phone call, but phone calls help. I think in the one sense, we've got a lot of experience in the healthcare sector. So acute care and primary care has had a substantial investment in digitising over that area. So we are pretty cognizant of what are some of these barriers. Very pleasing to hear the Minister talk about infrastructure, because if you don't have infrastructure investment, no one's actually here to play with this. But what Bill said in his final remarks about consumer engagement, if you do not have consumer engagement, if you do not have the interface, no one's going to actually use it. So at CSIRO, we've been looking at interface issues. So elderly, people with dementia, or people who don't speak English, or in fact, even one of my sort of the most excitable projects of looking at chatbots talking and training on social behaviours for autistic children. You have to actually invest in that type of work so that everybody has access to this. Indigenous communities have been phenomenal in previous projects I've worked with, looking at rheumatic heart disease monitoring, for instance, in as far afield places as Arnhem Land and others. You can do this, but you have to actually invest in the work that makes sure that it's consumer centric. So the other flip side to that is the workforce needs to do it. And there's been a lot of work done on the idea of what is the digital workforce, or what workforce is needed. Sadly, the average age of general practitioners, although I'm not actively practicing in that area at the moment, is my age. And that means that so many of my colleagues wouldn't know the back from the front of a computer, and that's a problem. The next is that we actually have large segments of the care system that need to be trained up in how to actually use this. But the other part is the interface has to work. I often say to tech developers, if you're adding 30 seconds additional to any of my consult times, I'm not interested. You actually have to make it seamless through the idea of those connections. So imagine you're in the community care sector, is you need that information now. That information needs to actually be presented in a way that's relevant to you, to the care of the person that you're actually engaged with. And equally on the other side, for the person receiving care, they need to have the information they need so that they actually know what steps they need to take. And it needs to be in a format that they can actually act on. They sound like big challenges, but then they're not necessarily impossible hurdles to cover. The other one behind this is work that we've been doing across other sectors. So imagine with the genomics mission, we've been looking at how do we store and interrelate and access the genomic information and the rich data that we have across the whole of Australia. Now, that, in a sense, has given us the idea of how do we have governance that actually allows us to track and trace that. Not too dissimilar from what we've done in the finance sector. So what's really exciting in the finance sector is we know where international transactions are going with an almost immediate level. Now, why can't we do this with health data? Why can't we, in fact, actually have those that type of approach? So the privacy governance issues, but the curation is what I mean is we collect relevant data, we stratify it as to its relevance, but then we present it back to the various facets that need to use it in a way that they can actually use it. So very excited. Now, why would we do it? Because a digital strategy in aged care would have helped us enormously through the challenges we've had with the coronavirus impacts in the aged facilities. And the same in the disability sector, the idea of linkage to how am I receiving my funding? How's that funding working? But what surety have I got that my care team know what's going on with me and that I actually know what's going on with my care team? The other part is how can I in fact look at the efficiency of delivery of service? So I think in the one sense, how is the workforce mapping out who needs to be seen now and when? That could be at residential level, but it certainly can be at community level. My experience in rural general practice has showed me that, yes, you can do this in your head, but it's far more efficient if you've actually got digital tools to support you. So I'm really looking forward to this opportunity, which is really what it is, out of a very bleak situation from this pandemic. This is an opportunity for us to actually reinvigorate the whole of the human care, not replace it with digital. The human part is vital. The digital is a tool that assists us to give that great human care.
Thank you, Rob. Really, really interesting perspectives there, and not forgetting about the human aspects as part of digitising services is critical. We might turn to Sarah as our last speaker, just to get your perspectives. And I'm quite keen, Sarah, just based on your background and your role, what do you see are the opportunities to make it easier for individuals to access digital services? And also, I guess, ultimately reduce demand on the system that exists today.
Thanks, Diane. Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of what I'll say is going to echo the themes that have already been mentioned. But one thing that I think we've got a great opportunity, not just during crisis to consider, but for all years moving forward, is the mindset that we're taking to human services. And so I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about the justice sector so I can dip into a couple of specific examples, but it all starts with us thinking about justice is not an institution, it is a service. And so when you challenge something like that with long-held assumptions about how it's been regulated and institutionalized, and rethink about how you can design it and deliver it using digital means as an enabler to design a better service with more access for people, I think you can really start to rethink the shape of what we're able to deliver. So I think really turning problems into design opportunities, it's a huge space and opportunity to meet needs. For one thing, it can do much to increase the responsiveness of how we carry important information and messages through to citizens. And I think there's a lot of people who are in the 85%, I think, that Bill, you were mentioning governments are designed for. What if governments can enable the 85% of us who are quite capable of meeting our own needs through self-service and being able to meet those on demand when we've got the time to be able to focus on them. The hope is that we're able then to reduce the amount of resources that government needs to spend on those who can and want to help themselves. And we can do that by participating in digital means. So, for example, what we're thinking a lot about is improving the access and the availability of the information and the way it's delivered to people as they work through accessing a human service. So digital resources, tools, services, they can provide communities access to legal information and education and help with lower barriers during the pandemic, but well after it passes as well. Digital tools often present opportunities for interactive, guided and personalized pathways for people with legal issues who can help themselves through different parts of the process of resolving a legal matter. And I think what we need to recognize is that large segments of our communities have adapted to a self-serve digital interaction style with companies and government agencies. And this is the way we now gain access to utilities, education, health, tax and other services. So the time for rethinking how justice might be accessed through self-service is now, because it's a model that allows governments to scale in the way that a justice system can't currently in order to meet the demands that are placed on it. And I think if any of us out there are in Victoria, there's something to be said about the way our lives that we lead now might be asynchronous to traditional business hours. So anyone with kids is probably feeling this very keenly. If we can give people information that they need in a way that makes them confident and have the contextual support to work through what they need to, we can not only reduce the pressure on frontline services, but also meet people's needs around the time that they have to focus on the task at hand. So as well as enabling people through the better provision of information, I think there's also something happening right now, which is going to be a force for kind of equal participation and empathy. So one example is that prior to the pandemic, we had people in the justice system who have been incarcerated, so they're defendants in a matter, and they might very frequently be participating in a hearing through an audiovisual link. And so the design of a courtroom has some way to transmit their image through a screen, but the defendants' participation in their own hearing and how meaningful they felt that engagement was often was a bit lower than the experiences felt by people in the courtroom. And it led to not an equal kind of experience for everyone. And what we're finding now is that people at the very top end of that institutionalized hierarchy are having to go through exactly the same, mundane technical challenges, having to think about how best to communicate through a screen, and thinking a lot about that builds, I think, a chance for us to have more empathy and a more equitable approach as we start to reconsider the shape of human services through digital as an enabling means.
Thank you, Sarah. Some really, really great examples from the justice sector there. So just before we move to the audience questions, and we've got quite a few coming in, so we'll try and move through them swiftly. But just a reminder for everyone virtually, you can pop your questions into the panel at any time, and we'll endeavour to answer as many as possible. Log into Pigeonhole using the password digitisation. And it will be remiss of me not to mention that there is a poll question as well on there that we will share the results back at the end of the hour, so please do hop on. So before we move to the audience questions, I just have a quick question, maybe just to put out to the panel, so whoever would like to respond. we've seen some incredible progress and advancements made in recent times, and you've all shared some of those incredible examples. What's next? What do we expect is next from digitizing services? What's to come?
I guess I could talk about having spent a number of years looking at what is the next tech that's coming through. I sort of outlined in the sense the idea of the chatbots. We all have Siri on our iPhones, as infuriating as that is. But the information, and that's really like what I call the analog version of the first step to where it is. The idea of understanding who are you and how do we support you. I have certainly seen technology that's assisting people with high prevalence psychological states, so managing their anxiety and managing their depression. And having been trained in cognitive behavioural strategies for a general practitioner, I'd have to say, when I learned it, I thought, this is code. Someone wrote these programs as code. They are sort of, in one sense, a way of supporting you through tough times. I would see that those steps, behavioural modification is probably the biggest disruptor that will come through, and trusted in a way that's not clunky, that's actually more acceptable to you. The idea that I gave of the chatbots socialising children with autism, how does that work in the sense, well, it's going in a randomised control study, which is how we do our work, but it's a trusted friend. It's not somebody who's going to, in fact, ridicule you or make fun of you, which is what happens to you when you go to school. So in the comfort of your own home, your electronic friend is actually coaching you on how you should have responded in certain circumstances and other settings. That in itself is at its very beginning, but that technology is moving very fast. So my pick on that, behavioural modification and enhanced by digital.
Thank you so much, Rob. Minister?
Yeah, I was going to say pretty much the same thing in terms of government service delivery. I think the next wave, and we're already moving along this path here in New South Wales, is a personalisation of service delivery to the individual, to the person, rather than treating everybody as somebody in a grey suit. Everyone's got their own needs, their own demands, their own wants, and if government services can tailor it to the individual rather than a class, then we optimise that service delivery. And I think there are three really important keys to any of these products moving forward or services moving forward. One is privacy, critical. And again, you use digital, as we've seen in Estonia, to enhance privacy settings, whether it's through privacy enhancing technology. You've got to use digital to increase privacy settings. Second is security, cybersecurity. I don't need to speak about that. It's already, everybody knows about how important that is. And the third thing is around transparency and ethics, making sure that when governments do provide these big service delivery options, that we have the ethical framework around it, particularly as we move further into AI and quantum and all these things that are going to rapidly accelerate over the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you for sharing those views, Minister. Bill, I might turn to you with a question that's come through on the live poll. And this builds on your comments around more complex servicing and supporting those with complex needs. So how does the strategy behind service digitization evolve for more complex services? And some examples provided are business services are often far more complex, multiple agencies, levels of government support required compared to citizen services.
I think the best, well, look, these are going to evolve anyway because the technology's here and you can't not know about it, right? You end up having to use it, it's just a matter of how long. But if you want a bit of speed and agility about it, you have to start actually on the periphery of government or outside it, because your institutional structure of government is too fundamentally hostile to personalisation. Was not designed for it. They'll try and do it by collaboration, which is, you know, trying to get elephants to dance together, and that actually is just slow and it absorbs enormous energy and usually doesn't work in the end, and the millions disappear. So you've got to go to the edge of the system, and by that I mean go to regional areas where you can start with the kind of cooperation that's needed. Go to the most complex, hardest cases, like your Indigenous communities or your disability community. And Australia's actually done a good job of this, getting started with the NDIS. Got a long way to go, but it's gone to the right place to start personalising. It's going to force digitisation because the transaction costs in that system are just, it's over-specified and the transaction costs are far too high, but it's the right idea. And people are willing to let that happen out on the edge. They're not willing to have too much experimentation in the middle.
Thank you, Bill. One for you, Rob, from Ankit Mishra. Thank you for submitting that question, Ankit. What are key government focus areas in digitisation of preventative healthcare? It seems like we are still focusing on post-event healthcare services primarily.
Yeah, the idea of actually putting digital into the preventive healthcare system is one that, in fact, actually is quite an exciting option. So many of us have these little digital tools that we wear around our wrists that tell our pulse and how we slept, and the others now. There's a wave of data points. I really consider those things data entry points. It's where that data goes and how that actually dovetails in with your care system is the important part that actually can assist you. So on one side, I talked about disruption coming from behavioural metrics where maybe through AI tools that we can in fact actually have a tailored program that knows how much more exercise you should do and some behavioural traits that you should actually decrease or be encouraged to stop, and that you accept, obviously, but they have to be would be set by yourself. But the other one is that your care team actually has got a dashboard of how you've been performing against there. So in collaboration with whoever it is that you actually require your primary care, is actually assisting you in some of those challenges that you face with where that is. That's in one sense the premise of precision well-being. So I am well, how do I stay well, and how do I find out I'm sick early enough so that something can be done about it quickly. That's what we're chasing as the Holy Grail, and I would certainly say that's what the new prevention will look like, Diane.
Thank you, Rob. Sarah, one for you from Chris Walker. Thank you, Chris. Can you comment on any strategies that public sector services should put in place to pick up those who are less able to connect and engage in digital services? I think we've touched on this a bit, but anything further you can expand on that one, Sarah, would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I think understanding and working with the communities that you serve is probably the best place to start, right? So we can't make assumptions. It would be wrong of me to try and tell you about that in a way that it doesn't serve the needs of the individuals that you serve. So I reckon go back to research, go back to engaging, go back to co-designing the services wherever you can, and inviting the communities to participate and have a voice and take action in how they want to be able to access those services. And doing that is going to do so much more than like reading 10 articles about it or anything I could tell you in a minute. And that's really important. I'd like to emphasize that human-centered design approach as a real friend in our toolkit.
Thank you, Sarah. Minister, maybe one for you from an anonymous person. To what extent are governments collaborating to ensure rapid development and rollout of digitised services by each jurisdiction?
Well, we've set up, well, when I say we, the federal government set up the Australia Data Digital Council, and that enables, it's a forum for all pretty much the digital ministers of all states and territories to come together frequently. I think we're having it, meetings every month these days, and sharing ideas around digital service delivery. So obviously New South Wales, we've got a lot of things happening in our space, but not to say that Victoria doesn't have a great idea, or Western Australia, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a forum for collaboration because so many of the problems that we need to deal with are require a federated solution. So we can move as fast as we can here in New South Wales, but you'll see the friction point at the border communities where people are moving back and forth, and that's where you really do need that federated approach.
Thank you for sharing that, Minister. Rob, one for you related to data, a question here around, should the experience of COVID result in an acceleration of open data in government and additional funding to make this happen?
Yeah, that's a very tough question to ask, because it's it's very hard to work out what's that blurry line between what we need to know and what we don't need to know, and the privacy line as to where it stands. So your idea of privacy is different to mine, and it's certainly different across the generations about who's happy to give what information to who and where. Probably the most important thing, and I think the Minister alluded to this in the cybersecurity, is identity theft, of course, is one of the big problems we've seen coming out of this pandemic. And that's one thing that we actually need to make sure that people aren't being to that. And particularly, say, in the disability sector, for instance, there are now financial pots of money that it's probably attractive to extortion or, in fact, other events, as we've seen across other health sectors. So I know that those are the negative parts to it, but sharing the data sets across there has been a major hurdle. And again, the Minister mentioned about the federation structure we've got. And having been with Kerry Chant on some COAG meetings in the past, Minister, and to see how the various states behave with regards to whose data is it, has been one. And that's been a hurdle for us to actually digitise our whole country. And that's why I look to Bill and go, New Zealand, you guys nailed it by having just one authority that actually looked through this. If only we could do that. So I think you were outlining that, Minister, in what you meant about your frustrations.
Thank you, Robin. And Bill, I might just see if you have anything to add on that based on your extensive experience from a New Zealand perspective.
Look, what makes the data really talk is when you link it and then when you use it. Data only gets better if you use it, and experts keep telling you, wait till it's perfect. Well, it's never going to be perfect. But bear in mind, you've got a technology and customer expectations that are completely misaligned with the behaviour of your public institutions. Now, they protect their data very strongly, which they shouldn't because they don't own it, but it was never really collected to be used. It was collected to be collected. And so a lot of it isn't that. You've got millions invested in data systems that are no use really to anybody, and particularly no use unless you link it with someone else. So you proceed with strong political leadership. That is, you have to make public servants share their data. They will never volunteer. You have to make them do it, or they won't do it. It's that simple. That's why it takes so long, because you have so it's either political leadership or you create community demand, which is we did a bit of both in New Zealand. So you want, when there's real need in a community, which can be met with linked data used under all the appropriate conditions of privacy and so on, then you'll find that the system responds positively to that, because everyone wants the needs met. And if that's a better way to do it, then they might do it. But just kind of having meetings and hoping people will share data, well, you'll be still doing it in 2030 and nothing much will have happened.
Thank you, Bill. We've got time just for a few more questions. And Sarah, I might put this one to you. What do you see, if any, are the impediments to greater digital service delivery, and how do we de-risk delivery?
Well, I think one of the fundamental truths, as the Minister's pointed out, is that investment is really necessary. So digital transformation is a marathon. It's not a sprint. It might be delivered in sprints, but it's definitely something that we need to think about as a long-term investment and strategy. And very often, as a service provider working with government, I find a lot of appetite to fund small-scale pilots and initiatives. And no matter how promising, some of them will not receive the funding to continue and really kind of understand the potential benefits. So I think that's one impediment, is securing funding beyond the pilot. And I'd love to see that happen more. I think the government, states and federal governments and various agencies are making great strides towards moving towards an agile procurement method and developing service provider panels, which is ace to see. And I think just to bring it back to the data sharing conversation, and particularly how digital transformation can have so much benefit from the ethical application of artificial intelligence. Without the great stores of data, without having access to that data that is safe, that is aggregated, that is considered private, being able to be made available to researchers and service providers that are both working with government and outside of government, I feel like that's going to be a big impediment. And so those three.
Thank you, Sarah. Minister, one for you here. Will the agile lessons of New South Wales' response to COVID see lasting change in decision-making and project implementation in government?
Oh, absolutely. Even before COVID, we'd set up a delivery and performance committee. It's the first of its kind in the world. Normally, governments are structured around political decisions and financial decisions, i.e. there's a cabinet, which is political, and then there's a treasury or expenditure review, which is money. Politics, money, politics, money. We've introduced a thing called DAPCO, Delivery and Performance Committee, which I chair with the Premier and a few other senior ministers. And it means I ask 3 questions before every project comes to us. One is, what's your data architecture? What's your digital design? What's your customer or your people lens? That means, for example, to Bill's absolute point, that you need to prize data out of agencies to open it up. If they want a part of that 1.6 million, they're going to have to commit to opening up more data. Otherwise, they don't get the money. And again, they're going to have to show me what they're doing in terms of privacy, and how we're dealing with the person as a whole rather than as a fragment of agencies. These are structural things that we had before the pandemic that we are absolutely now going to accelerate beyond.
It's incredible and definitely first of its kind. Very impressive, Minister. Thank you. I might open this one up to the panel for all of you to comment on before we close with the questions. We've heard a lot about balancing the human interaction as part of digitizing services, and we've got a question here that says, with COVID isolation showing the value placed on human interaction, how can you balance the digitization of services for greater efficiencies with the desire for human interaction in service provision? I might start with you, Rob, to comment, and then we'll get the rest of your reflections.
Yeah, I think in our Future of Health report, we highlighted that it is not going to be lost, the idea of empathic, caring carers, because the human touch and the human empathy, as Sarah so eloquently put it, is absolutely vital to the digitisation of services, because these are human services, and actually you can't take the human out of where that actually fits. So it may be that we actually in the future have a digitised house that allows me as a moderately demented aged person to actually live in my own home, supported independently to a large degree by that particular living space, but there were people coming in and there are people connected to the important parts, because we can't replace all of those things with digital at this stage, and nor would we want to. And I sort of reflect on the fact of the experiment we've got in Victoria at the moment, where everybody has been withheld to their house, and that in a sense is actually, boy, you must be developing some empathy to what it actually means to be, say, imprisoned in your own house, so to speak, or in fact actually confined to where you are, whether that may be from a disability that you've acquired or one you've had from birth. It's an issue of how tough things are actually going through. I would hope that from this, for all of us, that we actually learn the complexity of not being able to participate in a whole society. So that's another positive step that I would see. But I think, Diane, it's the human has to stay in human services. We cannot remove it.
Thank you, Rob. Bill, any building comments from yourself?
Yep, I think it's just listen to your customer. And that includes public agencies who hate the word, because a customer denotes someone with choices and power over your services. Well, that's the only way your public services in the end are going to change, is when your customers can exert their preferences. And so there's no reason why you can't have 3 or 4 channels. You have your digital, your digital delivery, you have your kind of reactive call centre, and you have your person who can knock on the door. Quite small NGOs can manage that. So why can't large-scale government agencies? But it's a matter of really listening to the customer, not talking about them, not just consulting them, but actually listening to them pretty carefully, because they all have different preferences, as Victor's mentioned, with personalisation. The second thing is if you are listening to your customer, you then need to have the supply side able to react to those preferences, and that's the hardest bit, actually. The digitalisation, in a sense, isn't that difficult. You do the investment, the projects are complicated, and some of them fail. But the whole supply side of human services is built around the sort of welfare state monopoly with universal services, and that is not a responsive system. It was never designed to be. So listen to the customer, and then you need to spend a lot of time on service design so that it can actually respond to preferences. Otherwise, we're going to go, I think this is quite predictable. We'll go through a process where digitalisation will give people the sense that they've got choices, and governments will talk about it, but the supply side will still look like the 1970s, and then they'll get frustrated. And maybe that's what we need to get the change.
Mr. What are your perspectives on Bill's comments?
Well, I constantly tell my team, I love my data, digital technology, but it's absolutely meaningless unless it improves one life. It's got to be there to improve life, to reduce suffering, and that's why I got into politics in the first place. But you need digital to be that rapid enabler, that tailored enabler. If I could maybe adopt that Star Trek model. You need the Spock and the McCoy. You need the digital being the Spock, but you also need the empathy being the McCoy. And we've actually done that through Service New South Wales, where you get the gold class treatment from that human empathy from people at the front line, but they are backed up with some really clever machinery provisions at the back that enable fast information flows and a tailored response. So, service delivery, to Bill's point, moving forward, I think most people overwhelmingly will transition to digital, provided they see that human experience being improved. And if they can see that, well, then we're well and truly on the path that we need to be.
Great. And Sarah, any additional reflections from you?
Yes. What panel on digital transformation would be complete without the Tinder example? So I think digital enables human connections through a variety of means. And Bill, one of the things I wrote down was electronic elephants dancing. It'll never happen. I love that metaphor and that image. But I was also drawn to think about people who are older, Australians in my life, who have wanted to dance with people and needed an electronic kind of matchmaking system in order to make that happen. So I think a narrow conception of digital delivery of human services leads you down a narrow path. If we're always challenging ourselves to think, what human connections does this open up and allow? That's kind of the mindset that we need to take forward.
Yeah, and just adding to that, Sarah, too, the excitement that we've actually received from our arts communities, for instance. We've had symphony orchestras, or at least small collections of those, playing for us in our own lounge rooms. We've had film festivals that have been screening, and it almost felt real. And we've even had some of our bands and others, in fact, actually playing under COVID sort of social distancing safe programs to actually entertain us. And the great joy of being able to tour our fantastic art galleries. You're right. There's the sky's the limit to actually how we actually make the experience something that's quite valuable and enlightening.
Thank you for that addition, Robin. And that just reminds me, just to reference the CEDA's forthcoming research report on the digitisation of human services to be released later this month. I know a number of you have provided your thoughts and submissions, and thank you again for Griffith University for sponsoring that. Should be an excellent read launched later this month. Maybe just one final question that's come through, and I'll read it out. So it's from Shuba. Thank you for your question. Are we actively partnering with technology leaders and innovators in Australia and around the world? Are there any incentives for innovators and early adopters in the government sector? Minister, I might throw that one to you for your initial comments, please.
Oh, thanks, Diane. I was trying to weave in this answer in one of my previous answers, because one of the things I'm proudest of is the way we are transforming human service delivery when it comes to homelessness. So about a year ago, we spoke to Microsoft and the Act to End Street Homelessness, and we got them together and said, look, how do we improve service delivery for people on the streets? Because traditionally what would happen is there'd be a census, like a biblical census. You go out once a year with a pen and paper and you write down, what's your name? Fred, okay. And then the next, what are the services you need, et cetera, et cetera. Next day, another NGO would come out, hey, what's your name? My name's Fred, why are you here? I'm divorced, et cetera, et cetera. It was a trauma. In fact, it was almost cruel, asking the same person over and over again about their traumatic experience that led them to homelessness. Digitising that so that we can get the information once, so that we don't have to repeat that trauma, is an example, world-leading example of where government can work with organisations, in this case Microsoft, to really enable digital to improve the life experience of arguably one of the most vulnerable in our community. So we need to do more of that, and I'm really passionate about this.
Thank you, Minister. Conscious of time, and we will get you to close and out of here on time. I might just open up to the rest of you for closing remarks. So Sarah, anything you feel you didn't get the opportunity to share, now's your chance. You've got a very large virtual audience on the floor, so over to you.
I guess one of the things that I'm really excited about seeing Australia develop is literacy, not only in terms of digital literacy, but actually a literacy that allows us to understand the true power of data and how machine learning and how artificial intelligence can be used in a way that is completely aligned with our values and our ethics. And it's not going to be an easy conversation, but I think that particularly when we're dealing with things as fundamental as human services delivery, that space can't be ignored. And I just can't wait to see, the leadership that emerges from our country.
Fantastic point, Sarah. Thank you. Bill, any closing remarks from yourself?
Oh, look, I thought Victor's example of homelessness is a great example of going to the edge of the system and to the most complex need, because you've got permission to do things there. One method we found that gives permission in the mainstream industrial production is to use the technology sector's incubation process. So we set up an incubator where public servants could get 3 months, 12 weeks sprint with some idea about some way of changing services, and it was amazing how much energy was released by people who'd spent, some of them had spent years looking at particular pain points, particular bad processes or needs, and given the opportunity to work with some technology people on that much faster cadence, was sometimes spectacular and occasionally commercially successful, because your public institutions just don't have that cadence except under really emergency conditions like COVID. So if you can create space for it, you'll find fantastic people in your system with great ideas, just need room to express them.
Thank you, Bill. And Rob, any closing remarks?
Yeah, look, just remember, this is extremely complex. If it was easy, we would have already done this. And I think that's probably what people have actually gathered from this. So what you really do have to do is break a complex problem down into doable chunks. And we've covered a lot of those here. One of those is definitely user interface, and that also is deep user interrogation, both from all sides, from provider through to the person that's actually getting that service interface. And the other one is the bedrock is how you manage that data set and how you in fact actually share that data set across. then there's the rest of the things. And as I said, there's around about 19 domains that you've got to step through this. And I'm sure Bill knows these off by heart as well. So it's not easy, but this is well worth doing because the benefits are astounding in improving how we can actually care for each other.
Great. And of course, Minister, any closing comments from you before I wrap?
Oh, no, I just think the biggest challenge for liberal democracies is making sure that we put privacy at the heart of everything we do in ethics. You know, that's going to be core to everything we do. And yeah, hopefully we remain focused on that task.
Thank you so much. So look, I just want to thank our incredible participants and speakers today for your time. I know you're so busy, but this has been an incredibly valuable conversation. And personally for me, I am so chuffed that I got to facilitate this conversation on a topic that I'm very passionate about. So thank you so much for the opportunity. I'd also like to again thank our live stream sponsor, Griffith University Business School, for your ongoing support to CEDA. And of course, finally, the audience who took the time to dial in today and for submitting all your questions and really participating in the discussion, even though it was virtual today as well. Please continue the conversation by connecting on CEDA via LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, the list goes on. And the final comment from me is the results from our poll. So we asked the question, what is the most important enabler needed for increased digitisation of services? And what came up number one? Community trust in how their data is used and stored at 37%, closely followed by connected data between government agencies and across levels of government at 32%. So certainly supportive of some of the themes and discussions today. So have an excellent day, stay safe, look after each other, and thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Diane.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dan.